Today joined by the Ukrainian Ambassador to the United Kingdom, Vadym Prystaiko, who has also previously served as Ukraine's Foreign Minister. Hello to you. Thank you for joining us on the programme, Mr. Ambassador. It's a pleasure to have you here. How concerned are you about what's happening on the border?
Quite concerned. All these 100,000 people is a serious danger. It's not enough to topple down our military, but that's serious danger for next, stage of aggression.
What do you expect to happen?
We hope that these negotiations will ease the situation somehow. I agree with the comment that's probably the Russians are trying to, to find a lever in the negotiations with the United States about the, stance in Europe, the rockets, the forces. Unfortunately, they're taking the Ukraine as pretext, and that's what we've been living through for 7 years. We now started, to get accustomed to this constant status of war. And I hope that these negotiations and the next in NATO, then in OSCE will allow to sort of ease the tension.
To what extent, though, is it saber-rattling by the Russian leader?
That's what I also hope, because of the language they use, derogative language, NATO should pack up belongings and get to 1997 somewhere. And then today's reaction, that's the first stage was astonishingly well went. This is something where I feel lots of emotions, and hopefully this emotions just to raise the stakes and push through the negotiations.
The West is very much focused on what's happening with China at the moment. Is this not, as some might suggest, just an attempt by the Russian leader to try to remain relevant?
He's becoming relevant and more in this area of the former Soviet Union. Look at the Kazakhstan, what's going on there. Belarus is already taken by Russians. Ukraine is more or less the last piece he needs on the map. So he's pushing. And I'm not sure how Western leaders are prepared to push as hard as Russians do.
Well, NATO has said they won't.
We'll see what NATO will do. At least a couple of days ago, they settled down the position, the common positions for themselves. These negotiations, the next ones, will allow to see where the parties are really stay.
I heard you speaking about the situation a couple of days ago. Quite inflammatory language, saying that we are potentially heading towards another world war. Is that really the case?
When the Russians started in Crimea 7 years ago, leaders asked us not to do anything, not to start this third war. Now we see that we lost 13,000 people over these 7 years. 7% of our territory is gone. The Crimea, 2 million people peninsula is taken by Russians. So, when we are hearing this language, that let us stay calm, let us think. Yes, we are all calm and restrained, but Russians are doing what they are doing. So we have someday we have to draw the line and tell them, guys, that's the line, the red, whatever you call it. But we are not fighting in this part of the globe in the 21st century.
And what is that line?
I believe the Russians had to go home. That's what they offered NATO, pack up their things and get home.
And what will make them go home?
That's a good question. I believe that the economic situation in Russia is not the best. It's not the wealthiest nation in the world.
But the economic sanctions are already in place, aren't they, from Europe?
Maybe they're not enough. If they don't feel, maybe they're not enough.
Is that what you're asking for?
I'm asking for this. We're also asking for the weapons because we have a right to defend ourselves. And some nations were very reluctant to provide us with.
As far as President Putin is concerned, we heard him speaking last week, and he was saying, actually, NATO did promise that they wouldn't move another inch further to the west, to the east of Germany, back in 1990, when we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he says that promise should be honoured.
First of all, this is urban legend. Even Mikhail Gorbachev, who was negotiating at the time, was mentioning that there was no such a promise. And by the way, we've been promised by Russia...
But that was the sentiment that was there, was the
Maybe, I don't remember that. I was 21 years old at that time. I don't remember any sentiment, and NATO didn't promise anything. What I do remember that when we gave up the weapons, nuclear weapons, we've been promised by Russia, United Kingdom, United States, that will be defended, and that's where we are right now.
Where are you as far as cyber attacks are concerned? We know that Russia is pretty effective at those.
They're always bombarding us, especially foreign affairs and the critical infrastructure with the cyber attacks. That's the matter, actually, the life we're living in. We're trying to, to gain more and more experience in that with the assistance of nations of the West, of the NATO. But that's normal life, unfortunately, for Ukrainians.
And what form are those cyber attacks taking? Is it against your health service? Is it against your banks? What is it?
Sometimes they're against the diplomatic service and our correspondence. Sometimes against the critical infrastructure like energy. We've been through a couple of blackouts because of the infrastructure being interrupted by that.
What would you say to I mean, obviously the talks are going on ahead in Geneva at the moment, but what do you want and presumably particularly the Americans and Europe more generally, what do you want them to do?
Thank you. That's a very good question. What we fear the most, that's a called big deal. When behind our backs something will be baked, and the Ukraine will be just the prize for the Russians to step down. This is something we don't want, and this is something we'd like to warn our friends and partners in the West. If you reach some agreement like that, we won't budge.
So you're asking for more economic sanctions, even more economic sanctions, although that is what punishes the Russian people rather than the Russian leadership.
If I have a choice, I would ask rather to help Ukraine than hurt Russians.
And that is in the form of
That's
troops?
economic help, that's troops, that's support, and by the way, that's NATO future for Ukraine.
What do you think Russia wants out of all of this?
Russia is trying to show that they want to have a respect in international communities. They return back as a second pillar, whatever they have. More importantly, I believe that this year is 100th year of creation of Soviet Union. Unfortunately, in Putin's mind, there is something, to celebrate. In our case, that's what we try to escape from.
He's an older man. He can't go on forever. Do you think? Well, I don't know.
I don't know.
Do you feel that potentially the West and maybe even Ukraine gives him too much respect?
I believe the Ukrainians definitely did, not now. And look at Nazarbayev, last leader of the same sort. He was 19 years in power, almost like Putin. And now all the troubles in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is very close to Russia, a mineral-rich country with very little of the freedoms. So that's the future he has to look at, not to Ukraine, not to West, but that's internal problems he might face very soon.
Those 100,000 troops are camped on your border as we speak. If they start to move across the border, what do you see the next move being?
So many dead bodies will be returned back to Moscow and Kyiv, that's for sure. And whether he will use the full extent of his might or just very limited to show us and the West that we have to get back to the table of negotiations. But we're already at the table. He doesn't have to move. If he moves, we will be fighting.
Russia is not in a position to be able to hold those 100,000 troops in Ukraine for very long, though, is he?
They have these troops somewhere, so they can keep them even close to Ukrainian borders. And when he has an idea where to spend his money, he would rather spend for the military than for his own people. So he can keep them for some time. And it's not the biggest number they had. In May, they have 135,000 people.
The Ukraine is not in a position to be able to, you say that you will be sending Russian soldiers back home in body bags. Again, you're not in a position as a country to be able to continue on with that level of force for very long unless you turn to your big brothers in NATO and the rest of Europe for support.
That's what we're doing. Unfortunately, we are not one of those family asking for the help. We just can't beg NATO and the Europeans to help us to get somehow of this situation.
How critical are the talks today and for the rest of the week in Geneva?
I believe that this time when we are talking still are relatively low risk. At least a week, I mean, we have this OSCE, NATO, and these bilateral negotiations. After a week, we will see what will happen.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, anything can happen. We've been through it. For many people here, it's something unthinkable to have war. That's what unthinkable for us 7 years ago. Now we are losing soldiers more or less each and every day.
And I'm sure that your countrymen are looking towards Kazakhstan and seeing what's happening there. Can they take any lessons from that?
I believe that Kazakhstan is losing the statehood. Something happened to Belarus before. That's what Ukrainians were warning of these nations. That, guys, if you wanted to be as ourselves, wanted to be independent, you have to rule better. You have to find some way to, rotate your governments, which we did. Not perfectly, but at least we are somewhere there. Because this way of you ruling your country is not sustainable.
And what would you say to the British government this morning, finally?
I see that your government is understanding what is happening, and I know that some visits to the region are planning right now. So the people here, at least in this capital, understand actually what's happening with Russia and around Russia.
OK, Mr. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much
Thank
indeed
you
for joining us. We do appreciate it.